Yeah, I taught international relations, which I like to call international politics, for about 35 years up at Chico State. And I did a PhD related to U.S. foreign policy and written a couple books on U.S. foreign policy over the years. And so what I'd like to do is more or less deal with the Ukrainian situation, but put it within the context of theoretical and conceptual themes and ideas, and to try to show that there's an analysis that can be made related to why the U.S. has been so involved in Ukraine, and obviously its focus on Russia. I guess we'll start off by reading a couple quotes that I think more or less give us a pretty good picture of U.S. attitudes towards Ukraine over the last 25 years, since 1991. And on August 1st, 1991, the President George H.W. Bush was speaking in the Rada in Kiev, and this was 3 weeks before independence for Ukraine. And obviously, we all know what was going on at that time. We're seeing the disintegration of the Soviet Union occurring. And from the perspective of Fred Halliday, the U.S. was involved in managing, quote, the ends of the Cold War. And so Bush was in Kiev, and he made the following comment, quote, "Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred." Those were wishful thoughts on the part of Bush in 1991. In December of 2013, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, speaking in front of the United States Ukraine Foundation in Washington, D.C., said the following, quote, "Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the United States has supported Ukrainians as they build democratic skills and institutions, as they promote civic participation and good governance, all of which are preconditions for Ukraine to achieve its European aspirations." And I emphasize European aspirations. Nuland went on to say, "We have invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine." That speech was given in December of 2013. 2 months later, in Kiev, we see the U.S. pull off a successful coup d'etat, overthrowing a democratically elected government. Just in November of 2019, Representative Adam Schiff more or less reflects the current situation in relationship to U.S. policy towards Ukraine. Speaking at a House impeachment hearing, Schiff said as follows, quote, "In 2014, Russia invaded a United States ally, Ukraine, to reverse that nation's embrace of the West and to fulfill Vladimir Putin's desire to rebuild a Russian empire," unquote. I must comment that anyone who's been following the developments in Ukraine over the last 10 years or so, and certainly focusing on events in 2014, we can say that Adam Schiff's interpretation of what's going on is far from reality. First of all, Ukraine is not a formal ally of the United States. Secondly, Russia did not and has not invaded Ukraine. And the politics of Vladimir Putin is to not restore the Soviet Union, and certainly not to rebuild the Russian Empire. There's tons of stuff I can talk about, but I guess what I'll do is to try to make a couple themes that I think are quite relevant to the current situation that we're in. And certainly these themes relate to U.S.-Iranian policies, focusing down on what occurred on the 3rd, yesterday, I guess, where Trump assassinated a major general. A couple themes that I think are very relevant. As a historian and a political scientist, I'm very concerned about people understanding this point. One, we're living through and in history. History is unfolding as we speak, and that the history we're living through now is the result of a long process of social and economic and political processes. Secondly, I believe very strongly that in the last, since 2012 and certainly 2014, in many ways history has accelerated dramatically. Just on one note, attempting to try to figure out what's going on in the world on a daily basis is almost overwhelming to try to put some framework analysis together. Thirdly, that we are living through a historical transition from a world system based on the Enlightenment ideologically and politically, and capitalism into something that Rosa Luxemburg first commented on, and that result will be either socialism or barbarism, and there's no middle ground. I think barbarism is winning the game at this particular moment. This fourth point that I think is very important is that the United States United States capitalism and U.S. imperialism is in tremendous crisis at this point. And maybe one way to explain it is that the post-World War II global hegemony that the United States inherited from Britain, and a hegemony that made the U.S. the dominant hegemon for 20, 30, maybe 40 years, perhaps more, is in severe crisis. And we're seeing a relative decline of the United States in relationship to the ascendancy of what one could call competitor states or imperial rivalries. And I think the fifth point is that Ukraine is a very, very important, if not a fundamental, geopolitical pivot that is very, very important for United States policy in its attempt to prevent or slow down its decline. So those are a couple introductory comments. What I'd like to do is to more or less frame what U.S. policy is all about, looking at three different layers, if you will. All three of these things, I think, can be melded together to provide a coherent framework. The first is based on a theory, and it's related to a combination of a number of Marxist theorists. I think, obviously, Lenin is central to this, but also I would include Antonio Gramsci as well. And a third, more contemporary theorist is a fellow named Robert Cox, has helped to formulate for me this particular framework. The key element here has to do with hegemony, meaning a kind of umbrella-like dominance over the global interstate world system. To have hegemony, a nation has to have at least three criteria. One, it has to have the most dominant and most advanced economic/industrial plant. Secondly, it has to have the most powerful and most dominant military. And thirdly, it has to have the dominant moral high ground related to the world system. In the 19th century, for Britain, the moral high ground centered around the notion of free trade. For the United States, it's been basically freedom, quote unquote, has been the moral high ground. We could spend quite a bit of time trying to define each one of those themes. In looking at global hegemony since the beginnings of the world capitalist system, and based on Wallerstein's views, that goes down around, it starts approximately 1500. There are other theories as to the origins of the global system, but let's just use Wallerstein's perspective, starting with 1500. What we see in that system are patterns where at a particular point a given Western nation has global dominance or hegemony over that system. But at a particular point, you see the emergence of competitor states or rivals to that hegemony. And during that period, we see competition, rivalry, and eventually warfare. Over the scope of that history, we've seen Portugal as a hegemon, Spain as a hegemon, briefly the Netherlands as a hegemon. And from about 1740 to 1815, we saw France and Britain fight 9 world wars attempting to gain global hegemony. In 1815, Britain assumed that role, and throughout the 19th century, we see Pax Britannica, where the United States Britain was the hegemonic power. But starting in the last third of the 19th century, we see the rise of competitor states. Obviously, Germany and the United States and Japan are going to be central nations in that process. We also see Belgium, Italy, and Russia as junior competitors in that dynamic. What that did is open up some 65 years of inter-imperial rivalry and warfare, and certainly World War I and World War II, and I look at both those wars as one war with an impasse for about 22 years. And at the end of that, in 1945, we see the United States emerge as the global hegemon. And obviously, that hegemon had the criteria that I mentioned before, and the U.S. went about to try to shape the world through a variety of policies and institutions so that it could dominate the world system. But we want to propose that starting 1991, 2000, some argue even 1968, that we see the beginnings of that hegemony beginning to be challenged. And certainly in the last 20 years, we're in 2020 already, in the last 20 years, we have begun to see clearly the rise of competitor states to the United States. The obvious countries are China and Russia. And so we, I believe very strongly, are in the midst of a period of inter-imperialist competition, rivalry, and war. Now, the wars that are going on have been proxy wars. Many people, as of yesterday, begin to fear that we're now entering an actual hot war. Time will tell. I have thoughts, but I don't have a crystal ball by any stretch of the manner. But I do guarantee you that there's no way to reverse this process, and warfare is going to continue and will accelerate. Barbarism or socialism, I guess, is the solution there. So I think that's the first level of the analysis to understand where the world is right now. And we're in the midst of inter-imperial rivalry where the United States, as the declining hegemon, is attempting to prevent its defeat in relationship to the rise of the competitors. Certainly, U.S. policy towards Russia, U.S. policy towards China, U.S. policy towards Ukraine fit very neatly into that framework. As a sidebar, real quickly, I will say that within the foreign policy establishment, there is differences over tactics. There is no difference over the objectives that the U.S. wants to achieve at this particular point. To even hint at what we might conclude with, that I personally believe the attack on Trump from the very beginning of his candidacy, linking him to Russia, has to do with a debate, a struggle, a war, in fact, within the policy establishment and the political establishment over how to approach Russia at this particular point in time, whether you try to co-opt it or whether you confront it militarily. Obviously, Trump is losing that game right now. The second area the second level, I think is very, very, very important, and I'm not quite sure how common this particular point is made, and we'll try to go through this very briefly. I think the second level that I link with the first concept has to do with a political theorist and, more importantly, a geographer from the turn of the century into the 20th century. And his name is Halford Mackinder. Anyone here familiar with Mackinder? Mackinder is a major, major thinker to understand global geopolitics. He was British. He was one of the founders of the British Royal Geography Society. He was a major consultant to the Foreign Office in the early 20th century. And many, many thinkers, political theorists, et cetera, have been strongly shaped by the ideas of Mackinder. One in particular I know you're familiar with is Zbigniew-Brzezinski, okay? His ideas are shaped totally by Mackinder's idea. His conceptual and theoretical ideas are shaped by Mackinder. Some of his anti-Soviet, anti-Russian views are also shaped by his own personal experience as a member of the bourgeoisie in Poland. But that's a sidebar to all of this. Mackinder, thinking about the world and geopolitics, came up with a theory that is very important to understand. And that theory is called the Homeland Theory. Excuse me, the Heartland Theory. I don't want to say homeland. The Heartland Theory. And his premise is based on a little ditty, if you will. And that ditty basically says as follows. Which East European country rules the heartland, commands the world island? Who rules the world island controls the world. And what he argues is that the heartland is Russia. And the heartland is because of the tremendous amount of natural resources that exist in Russia. Also, parts of China would fit into the homeland theory as well. And so when he's talking about the world island, what he's talking about is Eurasia as a whole, as well as Africa, which has most of the world's population, a gigantic global market, And thirdly, it has all of the natural resources needed for industrial society. So as some have called it, the heartland is the prize. And in many ways, Ukraine is the key to controlling the heartland. I hope we've made some sense so far, okay? So basically what we're arguing here is that when World War II ended, the United States was the dominant hegemon, but at the same time, the Soviet Union controlled the heartland. And certainly with the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the United States had no access to Asia or to those major powers at that time. But once the Soviet Union disintegrated, the United States policy aimed to, quote unquote, pursue absolute global hegemony. And what that entailed was to gain control and to command the heartland, i.e. Russia. And we would also add to that China. We can see policy at the end of the Cold War that were defined by the United States as it pursued this particular goal, to take over the heartland and regions of the world that were linked to the heartland. And that term was, there's a term for that as well, and Mackinder called it the rimland. And by the way, the Middle East and Central Asia are part of the rimland, meaning that they're the underbelly of the heartland. And it's not by accident that we've had wars in the rimland for the last 30 years or so. Although there are other specific motivations as well. Certainly oil and the Israeli foreign policy has a lot to do with this as well. But at the core of the U.S. policy when the Soviet Union collapsed was one to keep Germany in NATO, to promote free market shock therapy in Eastern Europe as well as Russia. And that also entailed class formation, meaning the formation of an oligarchic class in the various East European as well as Russian political economy. Thirdly, NATO enlargement, meaning to incorporate Eastern Europe into the NATO apparatus, which is basically an anti-communist, now anti-Russian political military alliance. And where possible, to promote color revolutions, meaning to use the National Endowment for Democracy, to use the CIA, to use the Soros Open Society, and a variety of other apparatuses to promote what they call nation-building, democratization skills, et cetera, to foster change so that allies could be created. Related to Ukraine, that we see one clear successful attempt at a color revolution, and that was in 2004 with what was called the Orange Revolution. The coup in 2014 is certainly something else, but the objective, it was still the same. The next layer, if you will, of understanding U.S. foreign policy has to do with national security memoranda, reports, and statements, which are shaped, I think, very strongly by the realities of the hegemonic system, as well as by the Heartland Theory. Now, the classic national security document was NSC 68 that was written by Paul Nitze, and it was a top secret document at the time. It was leaked later. and that was written in 1950, and that more or less shaped U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union all the way up until 1991. Basically, nuclear deterrence and containment were the key ideas that came out of NSC 68. We could go into great detail with all of this. Now, with the collapse or disintegration of the Soviet Union, we now have a new world. And you may remember George Bush said, he called it the New World Order, is what he called it. I called it I saw a sign in Washington, D.C. over a slogan, Bush's slogan, that said, "It's not the New World Order, it's the same old shit," is what it is. And it's actually piled higher and deeper, to say the least, since 1991, to be kind of blunt about the reality. There are three key documents that I think are very important to understand related to national security memoranda or policies. One is the 1992 Defense Planning Guidance for the 1994 to 1999 fiscal years. It was drafted in February of 1992, and you can guess who wrote it or who was central in writing it. Paul Wolfowitz wrote this. This came out to be the Wolfowitz Doctrine. Scooter Libby was also one of the co-authors of this document. There's a lot to say about it, but I'll read the key concept. Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formally by the Soviet Union. This is a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. We could use that as a springboard for a lot of commentary. In 2002, we see National Security Study 2002, which we now know as the Bush Doctrine. There are a number of points that came out of this. One is it's more or less a shift from deterrence, meaning nuclear deterrence, which became mutual assured destruction, and a shift to the realities of the time. The three major themes that come out of this was preemption, i.e. the Iraq War, military preeminence, obviously a massive increase of the military budget, and what was full spectrum dominance was a theme that came out of it, and also democratization was another element of that. This essentially abandoned concepts of deterrent, which dominated defense policy during the Cold War years, to a forward-reaching preemptive strategy against hostile states and terrorist groups, while also expanding development and assistance and free trade, promoting democratization, etc. And then in December of 2017, the third major document comes out. I'll be finished in a couple minutes. The third major document in this story, which is basically to catch up with the realities of geopolitics that had been underway at least since 2000 with the emergence of China, and also the role of Vladimir Putin in its assertion of the role of Russia in world politics, was National Defense Strategy of the United States, entitled Sharpening of American Military Competitive Edge, which came out in December of 2017. What this basically was a shift from terrorism as the centerpiece of American foreign policy to the concern about strategic competition, quote unquote, okay? Many people, in the first 10 years or whatever of 15, 20 years of the post-Cold War period, we've lived under, since 9/11, that's a way to deal with it. We've lived under this global war on terror, which obviously has created, at least 15, 20 million people dead, destabilized societies throughout the Middle East. We all know that history. But with the rise of China and Russia, the U.S. began to shift its focus to, again, strategic competition. The argument by this position is that we're emerging from a period of strategic atrophy. I disagree with that. The focus was on the Middle East. Secondly, it's a new world of competitive military U.S. military advantage has been eroded. There is increased global disorder, and it is also characterized by decline in the long-standing rules-based international order. Therefore, the long-term strategic competition with China and Russia are the principal priorities of this policy, okay? Was this clear? You can put, I think, all three of these layers together to get a picture of what really is going on.